Peter Maurer is the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Thank you, Peter, for being with us today. The ICRC is an organization with a strong operational presence in most, if not all, humanitarian crises, with working in close proximity with the people affected by conflict, violence, and disaster. In your opinion, how can this week's high-level summits on addressing large movements of refugees and migration make a real difference for the millions of people around the world who have had to flee their homes?
I think it's important to keep proportions and expectations in proportions. A diplomatic meeting, a conference, a high-level meeting never can solve immediately the problems of people on the ground, because these problems are much more long-term, they are much more structural, they need much more sustained effort. But it's important nevertheless that this meeting takes place, and I think two things are particularly important. A high-level meeting like this one can foster consensus among the community of states on how to deal with an issue. It can highlight possible solution. It can find policy consensus on an approach towards an issue of concern to the international community. It can highlight and therefore advocate for a specific problem, and therefore put this problem higher up in the agenda. So my expectations are that on Monday we will see a high attention of the international community, everybody expressing himself on the problem, and maybe some elements of consensus coming out on how to deal with the issues. And I think on Tuesday, with the US and other government-sponsored summit, we will see some governments coming forward and making commitments. And commitments do not solve immediately. They are not self-executing. They will need to be followed up. They will need implementation. There will be policy discussions within the countries, within regions, to decide on follow-ups on those summits. But it's important for guidance, it's important for policy coherence and policy consensus, it's important for advocacy, but we have to be cautious not to expect immediate solutions coming to people. There it needs a different kind of engagement.
Yes. When would you say that the ICRC already does today and plans perhaps to do even more to improve the situation on the ground, as you said, where the results of a summit like this, like the ones of this week, are not going to be seen immediately? So what does ICRC do for the people on the ground and those most vulnerable?
Well, I think my organization, as you mentioned beforehand, is an organization focusing on responding at the front lines of conflict to the impact of those conflicts and of violence on people. And therefore, with regard to displacements, our first and foremost concerns is first and second displacements of people, most of them internally displaced, some of them displaced into neighboring countries. So what we do in terms of assisting and protecting people, bringing food, water, shelter, sanitation, medical facilities and medical services to people, is essential to allow them to stabilize their lives and livelihoods in contexts of violence and war. What we are able to do in favor of the respect of international humanitarian law brings down, hopefully, the level of violence to which people are exposed, and puts less pressure on them to take a decision to flee their countries, to flee their contexts, and to become refugees and displaced people at all. So ICRC is really an organization working upstream at the flows of refugees. As a part and a member of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement, we then support people along migration routes together with national societies in order to respond to the humanitarian needs emerging when people are displaced along migration routes, bringing services and support activities, for instance, to the Greek or to the Italian Red Cross Society in the Mediterranean, to the Thai Red Cross Society in Thailand, to the Central Americans and the Mexicans in Central America. And of course, by the nature of our work, what we are good at is supporting family reunification, working on missing people, ensure dignified search for dead bodies and treatment of dead bodies, identification of dead bodies. What our national society colleagues do well is assisting through medical facilities, again through water, sanitation, help along migration routes to refugees. I think the Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement as a whole has a whole range of services to offer to migrants, from the beginning of first displacements in war to countries of destination at the end of the day, and to ensure that dignified life is possible even if they are displaced.
Mm. Thank you. You mentioned already internally displaced persons, and while the high-level summits of this week exclusively almost focus on refugees and migrants, people who, as you said, cross borders, leaving their homes, about 2/3 of the 65 million displaced people today are actually remaining within their own countries, internally displaced people. How, for you, is their situation related to or different than that of refugees and migrants?
Well, it's different in a sense that they are under a different legal regime. A refugee is a refugee under a refugee convention, and therefore has a powerful international protection instrument available in order to protect and offer a framework of assistance for a refugee. An IDP is a person displaced within a country, and therefore there are not so sophisticated legal protection regimes. On the other hand, I think the Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement as a whole, and the ICRC in particular, has focused all the time on not making law a divisive factor. Law is here to help people protect. But we have to address the needs of people, and the needs of people are the same whether they are displaced within the countries or whether they are displaced to the next country. So there is definitely a relationship between people displaced by violence and who are the ones internally displaced, and others are refugees. And it is important that we address those needs in a comprehensive way, and we don't make artificial divisions and between refugees and IDPs. I understand, because this is a place which is run by sovereign countries, that sovereign countries are sensitive on making this legal difference and distinction. But I think from a humanitarian point of view, it's more important to highlight the communality of needs that people have who are displaced by violence and conflict. And I think it's a little bit also pity that the summit here and the high-level event focus so much on the part of displacement which at the end of the day in numerical terms is not the most important part, and that you leave it to state discretion on how to deal with those issues. I think over the long run this will haunt the international agenda, because those who are insufficiently attended when they are IDP risk to become refugees over time.
Yes. Finally, this week we celebrate International Peace Day this Wednesday. We know that humanitarian crisis, and especially the context in which the ICRC works, are often the consequence of a breakdown of peace. But do you also believe humanitarian action can contribute in some way to restoring peace and making it last? And if so, how does that work?
I strongly believe that in order to be neutral, impartial and independent, humanitarian action has to in its modalities has to be distinct and different from activities which have much more ambitious political objectives, and peace is a much more ambitious political objectives than maintaining minimal rules of humanity in conflict. So they are concepts which demand for different methodology. But what I recognize is that good humanitarian action will contribute to stabilize lives and livelihoods, will allow people to stay where they are, will allow to sustain their lives where they are, and therefore humanitarian action can become an important building block. The law, international humanitarian law and its respect, is at the end of the day an element of a common value system which binds belligerents. And therefore it's the first step which leads over time, hopefully, to a more peaceful society. You can't imagine peace with disrespect of international humanitarian law during wartime. So international humanitarian law and humanitarian action, either operational or legal in its character, can be important building blocks for peace, while peace must be a much more ambitious concept, and it goes into how you organize your society in the most inclusive way, how you ensure participation in governance of the state, how you ensure equity amongst citizens. These are issues which are highly political, and you can have a lot of political views on how to organize your countries and what peace exactly means. So I think we should not make, while recognizing the difference in methodological approach, we should not make artificial distinction about those concepts. Good humanitarianism will contribute over time to more peaceful solution and will represent an important building block for peace.
Thank you. I think that's a very positive message to end this interview with. Thank you very much for being with us today.